Julia.
Hi. Hi, Terry.
Hi, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Oh, no, everybody's muted, that's why. Okay, so we'll start in just a moment.
I wanted to ask you if you can see me as well as the screen.
Yes, we can see your screen and everyone can see you as well. And I wanted to explain to everybody that with GoToMeeting, the way you view the screen is up to you. I'm not setting your view except for the presenter sharing a presentation. At the top of your screen, it should be the default set on View Everyone. That'll have everybody's video that they're sharing on your screen at once. Now, when there's an arrow, an up and down arrow next to it. When you click on that, you can choose just who's talking. So that's a good one because only the presenter will appear on your screen. Only Richard will appear on your screen. Active cameras means you'll only have someone who has their video turned on. And then if you just want to see the presentation, you would go to hide everyone. Then only the shared presentation will come up. And when we start in just a moment, everybody's going to be muted for the presentation. And you may have questions that you want to ask during the presentation. What you can do is go to the top of the screen and there's a comment bubble next to the participants, and if you click on the comment bubble, you can just type to send your comment or question to everyone or just to the presenter, or if you have a question for me about using GoToMeeting, you can choose to send it to me. And then at the end, we'll have a brief question and answer, and everyone will be unmuted. Okay, so this summer, we are doing a series of summer history programs, and we were sort of inspired by some of the famous tours of Long Island, and one of the notable tourists of Long Island is also one of Long Island's most notable residents, and that's Walt Whitman, and he actually wrote a series of articles about his voyage across Long Island, and at each stop he'd write about places he visited and things he saw, and he also wrote about the history of the places he visited. And so we're trying to do something a little similar, and each week we're having a different historian or author speak at our digital library. And today, to kick off our programs, we're very happy to introduce Mr. Richard Panchyk, and he's the author of Long Island Aerials Through Time, and he's also the author of a variety of other books of history and Long Island history. And it's the perfect theme, I think, for beginning because our series, because it's literally an overview of Long Island and its history and looking at that higher viewpoint, but also what Long Island used to be. So I'd like to introduce Mr. Panchyk to begin. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you all for joining me. This is now, I think, my third quarantine book talk, so I'm getting used to this. Hopefully not having to do this too much longer. But I'm here to talk about this book today, and it really is a treasure trove of photos, aerial photos of Long Island, and that Long Island meaning all the way, the physical Long Island, all the way from Brooklyn to Montauk. So my story is an aerial story. I moved into this house 23 years ago and in Westbury. And one of the first things I found was an aerial view from 1916 of my street, my neighborhood, and that arrow is pointing to my house as it appeared in 1916. So that kind of got me started on my journey in looking at aerial photos. If we want to understand some of these aerial photos, we have to understand land usage on Long Island. And in a nutshell, it's like a reverse genealogical tree, family tree. So in a family tree, you start with yourself and you go back in time. But in land usage, you start with a few people and you going forward, you wind up with more and more people owning the land. So the first people who came here from England,
We're losing your voice. We're losing your voice. It's cutting out.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you.
Make sure everybody's muted, and let's continue. Yes, so the first people from England, there were only a few people who had land grants from England, and they started off owning large parcels of land. But when you get to the present, things change. So here's an example. Here's a map of Brentwood, downtown Brentwood in 1915, and in those days, maps of Long Island had enough detail. You could have names of people who owned the properties. And you can't make them out exactly, but you can see there's names written on this map. If you fast forward to today or more recently, you'd obviously not be able to see people's names because the properties are too small and there are too many owners. Here's another example, Glen Cove in 1906. If you look on the left, you'll see large parcels of land owned by single people. And these are several acres, many acres of land. And then when you jump ahead to 1939, you'll see it's been further divided. And in some of the downtown, there's no longer names of people anymore because the properties are too small. But then you'll still see some people who have bigger properties, 32 acres, etc. Aerial views evolved for different reasons. The first aerial views were bird's eye views that you could commonly see in the 1800s and early 1900s, and they were usually pieced together images or taken from a hill or researched from the ground level and then made as an aerial view. This is one showing Farmingdale in 1925. It's actually rather late for a bird's eye view. And over time, they had different reasons for making aerial views and different ways to make them. Hot air balloons were the first, airplanes, then helicopters, and then finally drones today. The images in this book are images that were used by that were taken by the military, mostly stationed at Mitchell Field here in where I am in Nassau County in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and for military training purposes. And they are all different altitudes and all different locations. This is an example, Shelter Island, a pretty high altitude of 9,000 feet. Here's New York City at 9,500 feet, and this was taken in 1930. So you can see it looks like a diorama at this altitude. But then you'll also have some images like this, Shinnecock at 200 feet, and you can't imagine a plane flying at 200 feet over your neighborhood today. You'd be probably pretty scared, and it would not be allowed to fly that low. But this was a long time ago. Again, this is 1930. And the details are pretty stunning in some of these images that you see in the book. These are images that were given to the National Archives collection, and we're very fortunate to have these because they offer a lot of insight. So I like to think of some of what I'm talking about as the Little House effect as we look at aerial views of places over time. The Little House was my favorite book as a kid. Was written in the 1940s by Virginia Lee Burton. And it was the story of a happy little house sitting on a hill in the countryside long ago with trees and a pond and very happy children, family living there. And time passed. And over the years, things changed a little bit. There were more people moving in, more houses, and the pond was cut into a half its size, and there was a gas station, and there are cars. And as the time progressed and the book progresses, things got really bad, and the city kind of grew up around the little house, and until finally it was a sad little house in the middle of a big city. And luckily, because this is a children's book, it had a happy ending, which was that the descendants of the original owners found out and came and rescued the house and brought it out to the countryside and set it down and put it into the same setting where it was originally. But it just gives you some pause to think about how the old buildings you may see today are out of their context, their original context. As much as you may know them in their current context, you have to think about what it looked like when the house was built, what was the area like. And so context means a lot, and we'll talk about that again a little bit later. Here's an early aerial view, a bird's eye view of Riverhead in 1890. And aerial views, bird's eye views like this were often used for advertising and real estate purposes. As was this. This was all plots of land that were available for purchase in 1890. And all the area you see on the screen there in the center were plots of land. And at the bottom of this, it's not easy to read, but it says how pleasant it is and how easy it is to get there and how cheap the land is and all that stuff. So this is the kind of information that aerial views gave, and they were done for a purpose, which was here to attract people to buy land and build houses in Riverhead and elsewhere throughout Long Island and throughout the country. And if you go closer up, you'll see the streets have names. They're written in by hand on this. I'm not exactly sure if the street names are the same today. Some of them are, but you'll see that for sure there's a parkland in the middle of this. I don't think they followed the exact plan of what the real estate agent had in mind for the area, but obviously today all of the land is accounted for. So interesting early aerial view. Here's another one that was taken from this series of military views, and this was Greenport in 1930. Now, a lot of the places that I talk about have changed a lot, and a lot of the places I talk about have not changed a lot. Greenport is one that hasn't changed too much since 1930, considering. And if you zoom in on some of these images, because they're very crisp images even taken from a moving airplane, they're still very sharp images, and you can actually zoom in. So here you can actually see some of the detail and the piers and the wharves, and these old houses that you see are pretty much mostly still standing and along the main street in Greenport and elsewhere in Greenport. So it's interesting to note how aerial views can show you some places haven't changed much. If you zoom even further, you'll even see more detail, and you can really get a good look at, the streets. And there's still pretty much residential in that center of the screen there. And the waterfront obviously has become more developed, but you still have the basics that you see in this image. Here's an image of Greenport now, a satellite view. And you see it looks pretty much the same. You still have this kind of sump area that you had back then. See that with the green and the marsh and the pond there? It's still there today. And you've got a little bit more development on the water, but you've still got the residential Victorian houses that you see in the other image. Here's another local one, Brentwood Railroad Station in 1928. And what I love again about this one is that this is taken from 1,000 feet. I zoomed in, but you can see so much detail in this. You can see pretty much the needles on the tree and the leaves on the trees, and you can see a lot of detail on some of the buildings. So I find it's fascinating for that reason too, and that's why in the book many of the images I put in at the original full size, and then I zoom in because it's good to see that some of the detail that's in these images that comes out when you zoom in. Here's another zoom. It's the same image. I just zoomed in further, and you can see more detail. And if you live in Brentwood, you may recognize this area by the railroad station. And I talk about some of that in the book. But it is interesting to see what's what. And sometimes with aerial views, you have to get your bearings. You know, you're not always sure which direction is north or south, but it's always fun to figure out. It's like a bit of a puzzle sometimes to figure out where you're looking. Here's another one near Brentwood, which is Pilgrim State. And this was is a very famous hospital. You can see in this image how very sparsely populated the area was around it. This was 1938, and obviously it was built there because there was room. You can see clearly how much space there is. And again, here's another chance for us to zoom in, and you can see how much detail is in the central buildings there and the surrounding buildings in this zoomed in image. So it's really useful to be able to look at these images more clearly. And you know, the ones that I pull off from the National Archives were something like 18 to 20 megabytes. So if you know anything about image size, that's big enough, good enough quality that I could definitely zoom in. So other things that aerial views show you are things in progress, change on Long Island as it happens. So here's Captree Island in 1951. Originally, the only way to get to Robert Moses, you know, where Robert Moses State Park is now, was to go down the Jones Beachway and then all the way across, right? Across the past Tobay and past Gilgo and all that, all the way east. But once they built the bridge, the Robert Moses Causeway, as it's now called, it was much easier. So this picture captures just when they're putting the piers in the water, if you can see that line of piers, to build that. And then in 1954, same place, you've got Captree State Park now, and you've got the bridge built. So that's an interesting, again, seeing how things progress, and if you can find aerials that show, and if you look closely here, you'll see toward the bottom of the screen, you'll see the other bridge that connects Robert Moses to Captree. That's the, I believe, movable bridge there. It's just being completed in this image. So here's some more. This is Baiting Hollow in 1930 at 3,500 feet. And what strikes you in this image is the patches of farmland. You could be looking at Iowa or something if you looked at this image, but it's actually Suffolk County in 1930 when farming was even more important than it is now. And farming still is very important in Suffolk County today. I believe the statistic was it's the county with the most farm production of any county in New York State. I think that was the statistic that the former county executive had given me. If you zoom in on this image, you'll see some of the individual farmhouses, which is kind of cool, and the barn structures and the fields. And if you zoom in even further, you can see somebody's car, probably. I think you see cars parked in between the outbuildings there. So really gives you a very good, close idea of what's captured by these planes. And you know, we think of drones today and satellites, and everybody's concerned with their privacy, but considering this was 1930, it captured some pretty close details of people's daily lives here, even back then. This is again Baiting Hollow now, and still you see a lot of farmland in the image. So it's changed a little bit, but it's not changed that much that you can't recognize, you know, that it's a farming area. It's still looks similar. If you were to zoom in, you'd still see probably the same type of farmhouses in some of the image. So another going further west now to the area in Queens known as Whitestone. Remember that the Whitestone Bridge wasn't always there, and before it was there wasn't really a reason for a lot of this area to be fully developed because it was kind of out of the way. Once you had the bridge, though, this suddenly became, and once you had the bridge and you had the nearby infrastructure, suddenly it became more desirable. If you look here, you'll see houses still being built to the left of the bridge, and to the right you see an open space. So this captures that moment when this part of Queens was still not really developed. And that's why I like, again, why I like these images, because it's like a puzzle to look at them and to see what's different in then compared to now. Some of the images capture moments in time. This Cedarhurst image captures an event going on around the flagpole here, some kind of celebration, in September of 1924. And it's a little bit fuzzy, but you zoom in and you can see a bunch of people gathered for this ceremony. So it's really, you know, at first I look at some of the images and it doesn't, nothing jumps out, and you have to look closer to see that there's actually something going on in the image. And several of the images in the book I found as I studied them that I had stumbled across something very interesting. Now, there are some cool images of Jones Beach, which here is captured.
Sorry to interrupt you, but
yes.
someone was just asking if you don't mind. There's like a small bar at the bottom of the screen that you can hide, and they were having trouble seeing part of one of the pictures. Oh, thank you very much. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Okay, sorry about that. I can go back to. So Jones Beach had been constructed completed just a few years before this image was taken. This is 1936. It is not just any day, it is July. It is July and it is 9:30 a.m. And look at the parking lot, it's empty. So that's kind of interesting and telling, I guess. Jones Beach was popular then, but I think it's grown in popularity over the years. So this image captures an empty beach and an empty parking lot, except for some cars. You see the cars to the left of the water tower and on this image, but it's nowhere near capacity. It's very, very empty. And if you know Jones Beach, you'll recognize a lot of the structures here in this image. Certainly the main mall area, and then the bathhouses. But you'll also recognize some, you'll see there's some undeveloped, looks like less developed than it is now, and that's true. Here's what the theater used to look like. This was the old theater before the current one. And you'll see the stage was out on this limb here, and then the seating was to the either side perpendicular to it. So that was an interesting difference back then, and I guess the current seating arrangement's a little more conducive to hearing the show. But again, these images capture that moment in time, which is kind of interesting. This was the East Bathhouse in 1936. You'll see how pristine and new it looks. Back then, the bathhouse was used for a variety of things, including, there's a pool, and there was a restaurant, changing rooms, all kinds of facilities that have, over the years, had been reduced. So now it's just a shadow of what it used to serve as. But it's still there, and it's still an amazing piece of Art Deco architecture. If you are there, Jones Beach is interesting to explore for that reason. Again, here you'll see cars parked on the left side, but not nearly full. Just for perspective, how things change, here's Jones Beach in the 1970s. And if you'll look at that, you'll recognize, those of you who remember the restaurant that used to be there. That restaurant was there because the original Art Deco building that was in its place had burned down. So this restaurant was built, but then this was demolished. And the one thing about this picture is that I am in this picture. I'm the little toddler next to the stroller in this picture. So that's me. And then if you go closer to the present, that building was replaced by another building, which serves again like a food court. This building is now complete and it's open normally. In normal times, it's open. But again, if you were to look at this from an aerial view, you'd see the different things that have changed over time and stayed the same over time. Here's one that was really interesting that I put in the book. Some World's Fair images. And this one is from 1936. And this is the site of the World's Fair, but you can see there's nothing there. It's just a bunch of wasteland, which is really what it was. It was a garbage dump, and then the city reclaimed it and used it to build the World's Fair. So you jump ahead to 38, same place, but you now have buildings going up quickly. There's the Trilon and Perisphere in the center top. And you have the infrastructure, the highways to take you there. And then you go ahead to 1939. This was, when the fair was finally open. You see everything is in place, and it looks like kind of like a toy, a diorama, because it's so futuristic and shiny. But it actually looked like this from the air, which is kind of interesting. How some things look unreal, surreal. But this was very kind of surreal, ahead of its time. Here's another place where people had fun back then, in Coney Island, 1925. And it was in its heyday. You can see a lot of the rides if you look carefully to the bottom of the screen and to the center. Zooming in, you'll see the entrances to some of these amusement parks. Now, one of the interesting places on Long Island is the Hempstead Plains, which used to be the largest stretch of grasslands east of the Mississippi River, which stretched from New Hyde Park all the way through Hicksville, and was about 40,000 acres. So here's a picture of what it looked like back in 1910 or so. Here's an aerial shot of the last remaining piece of the Hempstead Plains today. And if you look at it, you'll see in the distance, you'll see some buildings, but what's in the center there is how much of central Nassau County looked for thousands of years. Now in this image, I'm standing actually in Eisenhower Park, which is another remaining bastion of some of the Hempstead Plains, because it was preserved largely because it was converted to a golf course in 1916. And then when the golf course went out of business, Nassau County took over, and it became the Hempstead Plains. It became the Salisbury Park, which became Eisenhower Park. And this was the edge of the golf course, which remained semi-untouched. So what you're seeing here is remnants of the Hempstead Plains. Hempstead Plains were also good places for military camps, such as, starting with the Civil War, such as Camp Winfield Scott. And then Camp Mills in 1917 for World War I, which was very famous and had thousands of men come through during the war in just a short period of time, really just within the summer of 17 all the way through 18. But if you look at the aerial view today, what you'll see of what was once Camp Mills is just now houses. This is in East Garden City. So Camp Mills, there's no remaining evidence if you look at it from the air today. And again, that is now, you're looking at Mitchell Field, which is also part of the Hempstead Plains. Mitchell Field was built on the Hempstead Plains, as was Roosevelt Field. It was a perfect place for building airfields and camps because it was so flat. So Mitchell Field was decommissioned in about 1961, but the buildings you see in the foreground are all part of Mitchell Field infrastructure that's still there today, and part of it is being used as Nassau Community College, and part of it is being used to house officers who are military families who are still living in the area. So that's an interesting bit of history. This is the interpretive center of the Hempstead Plains, part of that earlier stretch I showed you a few slides ago. And there's a recycling plant on the left in the background with the tall smokestack. But if you didn't have that, you wouldn't know where you were, because it looks so bucolic here. But again, it takes a lot to keep this the way it was, because there's a lot of invasive weeds and species that can come in and destroy what's there now. So one of the things that is part of the Great Plains were great airplanes, again, because like I said, Roosevelt Field, Mitchell Field, Curtis Field, these were all places where airplanes could fly because it was so flat. They didn't have to do anything. They didn't have to really flatten the earth or anything, because it was already flat. So what you're seeing there, the grass you're seeing there, that flatness, that was how they found it. Here's a Curtiss triplane. Glenn Curtiss was one of the first pioneers of airplanes, and he invented some really innovative airplanes. He flew in Mineola in 1909, one of the first to fly on Long Island. And then he built an airfield, and he built a manufacturing company right there in Garden City. And his planes were built there, and he had a field, and that became part of Roosevelt Field. So there's a lot of history there. Here's an aerial view of the Curtiss factory in the 1930s. And what you're looking at today, what you're looking at here is still there today, at least the front part. That building to the left is now a BOCES building, but it's still there, and the smokestack is still there toward the back, to the right side, is still there today as well. This area is the area of Stewart and Clinton in Garden City, if you're familiar at all. And what you see toward the top, I'll talk about a bit more, I'll come back to this. You see something with 3 arches toward the top center of the picture, and I'll be talking about that shortly. Here's another aerial view, and this one was taken in 1928, and that's the same complex again. If you look, this time I think you're looking west, and there in the center of the image is the Curtiss Manufacturing Company's factory and the building that's still there. And again, you can see how sparsely populated this area was, and how flat it was, and how perfect it was for flying. And it really was used for flying until Roosevelt Field closed in 1950, and then Mitchell Field in 1961. So there's a lot of history, and a lot of the aerial views in the book reveal all the history from the past. And sometimes the history is still there, like, for example, when you pass this building, it's still there today. Now, there is a current image of what it looks like. It's still there, Curtiss Engineering Corporation. It says right there on the building. And the smokestack actually has the letters CURTISS on it still. If you look closely, you can see that. So the rest of the manufacturing complex is gone that you see in the image here. All the back buildings are gone, but the little building in front of the smokestack is still there, and that's that. So I always thought that was kind of cool, because it's like, I like to connect what I have, connect the history that I have uncovered with the present day, because it's easy enough to just have a book of history, but you need to have connections to the present so that you can understand how we got here, and where we are now, how we got here. And here's a drone view, an aerial view now of that same area. So, you know what? Maybe some of that infrastructure behind it is just been renovated, and it's because I'm looking at the bottom floor, the bottom of it, and it looks like it is the same architecture, but it's hard to tell at a glance if it's exactly the same or not. In any event, the building is still there, and there's an aerial view. And obviously, here's a Stewart School on the right, bottom right. but you can still see how flat the area is even today. But it's now been built mainly with retail, some industrial, and housing. And here's another view. This is now, we're looking at Mitchell Field. We're looking toward the east, southeast, sorry. And this is what you see, the checkered roof on the left is now the Cradle of Aviation Museum. If you haven't been there, you should take a trip there. It's fascinating. But that is a repurposed hangar from Mitchell Field, as are the two buildings to the right of it. The Children's Museum is one of those buildings. And then you'll see, in the distance, you'll see the Nassau Medical Center to the left, and then closer to the right, you'll see Nassau Coliseum and the Marriott and other buildings. So really, again, aerial views give you a chance to study what things used to look like. It's perspective. It's all about having perspective on where we are and how we got here. So this is in the book, I believe. This is Mitchell Field, and you can see this is the land side, the base side of it, where the officers' housing is. The parade ground is there on the right side, and that today, the parade ground is used for, you know, it's like a quadrangle. It's used for Nassau Community College students. They play football and soccer there. And here's a current view. Same, if you can see the semicircle there. There's actually, this is a northern semicircle, and there's one on the east side. So this is the one on the east side, and there's still the officers' housing, Nassau Community College, and then you see Nassau County Medical Center there. And you just see how flat, how amazingly flat this part of Long Island is, and that's, again, Hempstead Plains as far as the eye can see. Here's another aerial view from 1940 showing the runway, and I put arrows there to show you that little bulge on the left. That is the east side. That is what I just showed you here. So that's that in 1940. And the bigger one on the north side is that semicircle here. So this image is actually flipped. South is at the bottom of the image. But what you see, interestingly, there's a runway complex that you can see very clearly, but kind of interfering with that, sticking into it, is the polo fields of the Meadowbrook Polo Club, which was right adjacent. And then right next to it on the, below that is the golf course. So you see how Mitchell Field was kind of wedged in to a bunch of other things, which is interesting. And if you were to superimpose a current view onto this now, you would see the Coliseum, where the runways are, and you would see, you know, those, you can see in this image, if you look closely, you can see the checkered roofs of the hangars, and that's where the museums are today, Museum Row. A very famous scene was filmed on the runways at Mitchell Field, and this was a scene from The Godfather. So this hit scene, murder scene, famous, and it was supposed to take place at a toll booth at Jones Beach, but it was filmed on the runway at Mitchell Field. So in this image, that part of the runway hasn't been built yet. It was to the left side, and it was to the very left edge of the runway, running left to right, and it extended further, kind of almost into the golf course and curved around. So that's where this was filmed. There is a bit of remains of this runway still left today. The only remains of any Mitchell Field runway that is clearly visible, and that is here next to Nassau Community College parking lot. And that's where the scene from The Godfather was filmed, on this piece right here on the right side. But even today, I went back and I looked, and they were building a police headquarters which obliterated part of that runway. So that picture was as of last year. So I don't know how much of the runway is going to survive, but aerial views do show change, and change happens fast sometimes. Unfortunately, one field led to another. Roosevelt Field led to the other Roosevelt Field that we all know. And now I'm going to talk about William K. Vanderbilt and his famous highway, which goes all the way from Queens to Suffolk County, or went from Queens to Suffolk County. The genesis of the highway was a bridge that didn't exist back in 1901, which was, if you look at the arrow in this picture, that is Post Avenue in Westbury. And that is the site of the first ever train and car collision in the United States. And William K. Vanderbilt, who was from the famous Vanderbilt family, was a witness to this collision. It was an at-grade crossing. And, you know, a few years later, he began the Vanderbilt Cup races, which started in 1904 and were very famous. But the one thing that he had in mind through this time was how these roads were not made for cars, they were made for horses. And so his goal was to create the first modern highway in the world. So the image I showed you earlier shows a piece of that highway, which is called the Long Island Motor Parkway or the Vanderbilt Motor Parkway. And what you see here is the Motor Parkway on the top over another road. So when he built this highway, not only did he build this 40 plus miles of highway, there were no at-grade crossings. There were none. It went over or under railroads or bridges, other bridges or other highways or other roads or farms. And this is one example. There are 65 bridges on this, so that there was never a chance that anyone driving on his road would collide with anybody else. So it was brilliant. And as you may know, we're still dealing today with the issue of eliminating grade crossings. And Willie K. Vanderbilt didn't have to deal with that because he took care of it back in 1910. So here's another, this is an image showing the area of the Meadowbrook Club in East Garden City / Westbury / East Meadow. And what you're looking at to the right would be Eisenhower Park. To the left is the club. And then where the arrow is pointing is the Motor Parkway. And again, you see it as a bridge over another road. So this road was really a part of Long Island's landscape for about 30 years, and then it was eventually closed because it was obsolete. It was too small, too narrow, and the Northern State Parkway was being built, Grand Central, Northern State, and there was just no need for this. So much of it was destroyed. Thankfully, there's a piece left. What you know as the Vanderbilt Parkway in Suffolk County doesn't really look anything like it. It doesn't have any of the original pavement. But there are some stretches in Queens in the Alley Pond Park that are the original Motor Parkway. So here's another close-up of what you can see there, the bridge. And you know, this was a lot of work because you were going at grade level, and then you had to have a rise and then come down again for these bridges that were built. There is one bridge abutment left in Suffolk County. This is in Melville, and it's on Maxis Road. And this bridge was built in 1910. There's the abutment. So this bridge was actually over a farm. And he built the bridge over a farm because this farmer was not going to be able to get from one side of his farm to the other. And so he built a bridge so that the farmer could cross and get to the other side of his farm. Now, one other thing that these aerials show sometimes is natural disasters. Here's Long Beach after a storm in 1920s. So today we're not just dealing with Hurricane Sandy type things today, where the people along the waterfront have always had issues with storms going back that far. Aerial views can also give you a frame of reference, interesting frames of reference that you may not recognize, but somebody who was alive back then would. Now, this is a school, this is a university. It's where I went. Looks nothing like this now. This is Adelphi in Garden City. There were only 3 buildings on the campus back then. You see them right there. So the people who went back then would recognize this. I would recognize it based on what I saw when I was there, and now it's changed a lot since I was there. So aerial views can give you clues, but sometimes it's hard to figure out what you're looking at because it's so different. We create for ourselves mental Milleridge villages. You've probably all been to Milleridge Village, but you know, the interesting thing about Milleridge is that it was made in the 1950s to appear to be from the 1850s, but now it's already 70 years old or so. So now it has become an antique itself, just in existing this long. But we create these images of places based on what we know them as, and then we struggle sometimes to figure out what they look like today, because to us it'll always look like how it looked when we were in college or when we were that age. And it's interesting because we all have different reference points and we're all talking to each other about places. And when I talk about Adelphi, I say that building is new, well, when I actually mean it's 20 years old or something. So it's all about reference points. Some places don't change at all. Here's Sands Point. This was a mansion that now, you know, is a museum, but it hasn't really changed, this area, if you looked at it from an aerial view, because it's been preserved and the house is the same and the grounds are the same. So my final thought here is to go backwards in time and look at it this way for this particular place, which is the Roosevelt Raceway. So this is what the Roosevelt Raceway looks like today. It's a theater built on the site of the former racetrack, which was the Roosevelt Raceway in the 1960s. And then before that, this was the Roosevelt Raceway track in the 1936. This was the sequel to the Vanderbilt Cup races that had ended on Long Island. They ended in about 1910 or so, 11. But they were brought back to Long Island in 1936 with this spectacular track. And this image was taken in September of 1936. This one was in the book, is in the book. It's fascinating because it was taken in October, and it was taken this very day of the Vanderbilt Cup race. So you'll see 1 million cars parked on all sides. And when you zoom in, you'll actually see the cars on the racetrack, which is kind of fascinating. But this image was taken at the moment when the race was going on. So, you know, this can't be, that's what I was thinking when I was looking at the images. This can't be a mistake or a happy accident. This must have been a flight that was taken on purpose by the military, which wasn't more than 5 minutes away, to fly over this and take a picture of it as it happened. And that's what they did. They captured this race in progress, which is kind of cool. So the book is full of surprises like this, and the images are full of moments and surprises and places throughout Long Island that are kind of cool and fun and interesting. And I've been researching Long Island's history for a long time, and this is one of my many books about Long Island, but I think it's also one of the coolest ones because it covers an interesting perspective. It kind of takes it from a different viewpoint. And, you know, sometimes that saying, sometimes you can't see the forest for the trees. Well, here is a way for you to see everything from a height. So this is a way for you to get perspective, and history is about perspective. So that's what I have to say, and I'll be happy to take your questions. You can pick up a copy today at Amazon or bn.com or anywhere online, and eventually when you're allowed back in a bookstore, you can probably get it there as well. But now I will open up the floor to questions, and I thank you all.
I would really appreciate it if you could go back to the slides from Brentwood without that little bar across the bottom so that we could see what we might have been missing in those photographs. If that's not too much trouble. I don't know how your PowerPoint is working. And they always made us believe that Sonny or Fredo Corleone got it on the Southern State Parkway by the toll booth. I guess they built it on the airstrip, huh?
They certainly did. Here's one of the images, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Let me see what we're missing here. Okay, thank
And
you.
this one, yeah. And here's the other one. That's a zoom.
Okay, you can see the Quanahasset Hotel, which was built in the late 1800s, which still looks exactly the same. I'm trying to see what that area to the right of the Quanahasset, I guess it doesn't really look like it's a building. Oh, but look behind the Quanahasset, you can see the Presbyterian Church, which is now the Masonic Lodge.
Right.
See?
And you can see, Ellen, you can see I think it's the Kohler's house next to the church.
Yep, that's Kohler's house.
But you don't see the general store.
I think it was in the Quanahasset. Before to the corner, it was in the Quanahasset when the post office was there. I don't know if you can see any, I'm trying to zoom in. I don't know if that's zooming everybody, but I have pictures of the Quanahasset that show the post office off to one side and the general store off to the other side.
Yeah, because Ellen, that structure to the
Far
right looks, to the far right. That looks too far away to have been the general store, I think.
Well, it doesn't look like that building even remained.
Right.
That building has the word Brentwood on it, if you look closely.
To the far right?
Yes.
Okay,
I can't see. Yeah, I can't see that well.
Yeah, I can't. Oh yeah, I know. I do see it says Brentwood. I don't know what that was because that wasn't the firehouse. It wasn't the wooden firehouse.
No.
But it's clearly not been there for a long time because it isn't the old Kohler's store from the corner.
No.
Ellen, Linda, we guys are newbies. We're looking at this building on the left that looks dark, mansard roof with white on the second floor and dark on the first floor. What building is that again?
That's the Masonic Lodge, but it's now white. It's painted white now. It was the Presbyterian Church.
So that's Brentwood Road?
Yes.
To the left, it was actually probably called 5th Street at that time.
Okay.
I don't know that it was actually called Brentwood Road at that point in time because the maps indicate it to be 5th Street. I think you had a map, Richard, also on a previous slide, a Brentwood map.
Ellen, before we leave it, this is I see the train station way down here by the bottom.
Right.
Yes.
And then this big oval kidney shape. And then you're saying the building right across the street from that oval is the Masonic?
No.
No, that's the Quanahasset Hotel, and that's still there.
That's what I wanted to know. That's the Quanahasset Hotel.
Yes.
I'm asking about something else.
And it still looks pretty much exactly the same.
The one, Kathy, the building with the 3 gables to the right, to the left of that, that's the Presbyterian Church.
That's what I thought. That's what I thought.
And the one behind that was Kohler's house that was torn down and became Friendly's, and now it's People's United Bank.
Gotcha.
But Ellen, it doesn't even look like 2nd Street is there at all.
No, you can't see for the trees. I don't know.
I
Well,
don't think so.
Here, see, that's a broader view.
Yeah, no, I don't think so.
Oh,
And
you're right.
right? And now what about that?
Now,
I
if you
can't
go to
pronounce
the
his last name. What,
If-
Ellen, what about Phil Gedalius' house? I mean, his,
Well,
right?
this is
I
too
think that
early.
predates that. Where's that in all of this? And
I-
Richard, I'm sorry, but we're passionate about Brentwood. You can tell that, right?
Bill Gedalius's that house was built probably in the 30s. I think
Oh,
it was probably built shortly. But if you follow the road in front of the Quanahasset across Brentwood Road to the other side, which now is Ross Park, that's where Charles Codman's house is. And in fact, it might be, if you look to the very far left of the picture, there's a white structure.
Yeah.
That might be Codman's house because he was.
Oh, wow. All right. Now I'm wondering, and I don't, I don't know when that happened, but the minister's house, the manse for the Presbyterian Church, used to be like diagonally across from the church to like where that
Where Checkers is?
where Ross Park is. They used, and it fronted Ross Park, and there was a little like a dirt path into the driveway, and then they moved it to where it is now. That was a big deal. That was probably in the early 70s. I'm not sure.
That's much later.
Yeah, but
that's
I mean, it was there when I never remember it, not being there. But
You were little in 1928, Linda. This is way before.
yeah. But Ellen, what was interesting, Richard, when you showed another picture of Brentwood, you could see like where the library is, but you could see the house that's across the street from the library that was for sale a couple of months ago. The old brick house.
Yeah, I know which one you mean.
You could see that. So that one, I think is from the late 20s. Because Arlene and I looked up to see what date it was, because the realtor told me a date, and I was like, I went in, me, and the realtor gave me a date, and I was like, I think you're off, but I don't want to say anything, and it was earlier.
Richard, could you go back a slide to the map of Brentwood? I think it was probably the slide before this.
Yeah, the map is not a great quality, but you can actually see this map, Historic MapWorks. If you go there, it was hard to screenshot that, but you can see it for yourself there more clearly on the screen than it is here, because this is a screenshot.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I know screenshots can be difficult sometimes.
So if you go to Historic MapWorks and then you look under Suffolk County 1915 series of maps, and then you'll find this map there.
Okay.
And you can look at it, but you can't, you can't print it, but you can look at it close up and you'll see the names more clearly.
Wow.
I saw Austral on the map just past this one. I don't.
That was Glen Cove.
Austral Avenue. Oh, okay. All right. I guess that's just coincidence then, because we had an Austral hotel here in Brentwood on the grounds of the Sisters of St. Joseph. I wonder if it's the same Austral.
Does anybody else have questions for me?
This was fascinating, by the way.
It was fascinating.
It really was terrific.
Yeah.
And
Thank you, Richard, for indulging
It was
us.
very good. Thank you.
Yes,
Did
thank
enjoy it.
you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Richard.
Okay.
Definitely.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. If anybody has any more questions that you wanted to put into the comment, you can. Or
I haven't ever put the
Because they were seeing his screen.
oh, I'm sorry, did I miss one of them?
no, there's EW.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody, and thank you, Richard, and we look forward to seeing everybody next week.
Around.
Peter, did you end this meeting? What's going on here? Donald said goodbye.
Oh, pardon me,
Okay.
I lost my connection.
I'm here too.
Oh, hi, Julia. Is that Julia?
Hi. Yes.
Okay,
I don't know, you guys just, I don't,
I was just a little frustrated because his microphone kept kicking out.
Right.
yeah,
I don't know how we correct that or, for future presentations. I don't know. I've seen that to be a problem in almost all of these virtual meetings. So I don't know if there's really anything that can be done, but
yes, sometimes there are glitches.
yeah, I mean, we do the best we can. It's better than nothing.
Exactly, exactly.
So,
All right, well, thank you,
Kathy-
everybody. Sorry for that lost connection at the end.
that's
No,
okay. We're good. So what was it? What was that website? Suffolk MapWorks?
Historic MapWorks.
Historicmapworks.org?
I don't know. He just said Historic MapWorks.
All right, I'll Google it. It'll come up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
You could say like aerial photos, historic MapWorks. I don't, something like that. Peter, that might be something good for genealogy too,
Oh, yeah, that is a good topic.
right?
Okay, I'm leaving, guys. Bye,
Yeah.
everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
See you tomorrow. Bye.
See you tomorrow.